What's going on, everybody, and welcome to the Girl Gang Garage. Now, you're watching this video probably for one of two reasons. Either you just finished watching the most recent episode of Motortrend's Work From Home, where I repair my Nash Metropolitan and my BMW decides to break down on me, or you were just Googling diagnosing a no crank, no start condition for an E92 BMW. Or I guess there's a third option. You could be watching because you're just super awesome and you love supporting me and watching my videos, and for that I appreciate it and thank you. So if you didn't watch the Motortrend Work From Home episode, here's what happened. I have a little Nash Metropolitan and I needed to get it back on the road because this guy needs to come off the road because it's in desperate need of a new paint job and a whole lot of love. I've been horribly neglecting it for way too long. Now, unfortunately, as I was bringing this car or driving this car to the parts store to get parts for the Nash, he decided to break down and not start. No crank, no start, no nothing. Wouldn't even take a jump because turns out the battery is good. So I got it towed back, I got it pushed in, and we didn't have time to show it on the Work From Home episode, but I wanted to share with you guys what happened, how I figured it out, and how I repair it. So we are going to dig in and start diagnosing this no crank, no start condition, my E92 BMW. Now, first thing first, obviously you want to check your battery because your battery is kind of vital to cranking and starting. I've checked that, it's got 12 volts, it's good to go. So what's next? Well, first thing I want to check is whether the starter is getting power. If it's not getting power or the signal to engage, then we might be looking at a computer issue, right? There could be a push button start issue. There could be a security system module interrupting the signal to the starter, keeping it from engaging. But before we get into any of that complexity, we have to check the basics and see if I have power to the main terminal on the starter, as well as the signal when I'm turning the key or pushing the button to engage the starter and get this thing to go. Now, the challenge with this is getting to it. The engine sits like this, if this is your oil pan and this is the top of your engine, and our intake manifold comes out over here. Our starter sits right nestled in here, so you can't get to it from underneath, and you can't really get to it easily from up top because the intake manifold is there. There is a hole, kind of access in between the different ports of the intake manifold where you can get in to gain access kind of with a long screwdriver to get at the terminals, or you can take a whole bunch of stuff apart and fish your arm around and reach in to get contact. So I'm going to start taking some stuff apart so that I can gain access to it a little bit more easily. And the first thing that we want to do there is take our air intake box out of here. I'm also going to take this whole cabin filter tray and cover off and out of there. All of that's going to give me a little bit more access to get down to where that starter is so that I can test its connection. To remove the air intake box, you've got a couple of metal clips that are just spring-loaded. And just pop those off. And then it's got a little lip in the back that it's tucked in, so kind of pull it up and bring it forward. We've got a connector back here. This one can be a little bit tricky. You want to be really careful not to break the release clip. There we go. You can see that this is a little teeny tiny clip that will release it so that you can get that removed. And then we've got a clamp back here. We'll just loosen the hose clamp on that. Bottom portion has a couple of wires that are connected with rubber boots, so you can just slide those up and out of the way. And then it's just held in with rubber bushings on plastic studs. So you just kind of lift it up And then it'll slide out of there. And then you just wrangle it out. Let go. Right. Removing this tray is relatively simple. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little 8mm screws that are going to come out. This will come out, and then 2 more bolts hold the whole tray down, and the whole thing will slide out of here. Underneath here is also where your cabin filter is, so if you ever need to replace that, now you know how to do that. So these little covers need to come off as well. This is just a rubber tab that'll slide out, and you've got 2 tabs, one there and one on that side. And release the tabs. And that whole thing pops off to reveal your ABS module and your brake fluid reservoir. Same thing on the other side. And then you can also see right there is the bolt that holds this whole tray on. There's one just like it on the other side, and then this whole tray will just come out. Now that I have all of that removed, I can kind of get to my starter through this hole in the intake manifold. It's a little bit difficult to get at, but I can gain access with a long screwdriver so that I can just barely touch that large terminal, and then I can just use my test light to see if I have power there. So I'm going to hook up my test light, climb on inside this engine compartment. We'll double check our connection, make sure our test light is powered up properly, and it is. So now I'm gonna climb in and see if I can gain access to that main terminal. All right, beautiful. And now we should have power here all the time. And in fact, we do. So that's a good thing. That means we have power to the main terminal of the starter, but that doesn't tell us if our starter is getting the signal to actually turn over. So the next thing to do is check that signal wire. Now, in some cases, you can get at the starter. The smaller terminal is your signal terminal, and you can test there while somebody is cranking. There's 2 challenges right now. One, I'm alone. I don't have somebody who can turn the key while I check for voltage, but also I can't get to that little terminal from here very easily. It's a little bit more challenging, but the good news is that BMW has given me an access point. Right down here, there is a wire that goes to a little connector that winds its way back to that starter, and that is my signal wire. Now, if I had somebody here to help, it would be really easy. I could just put my test light on that wire, have somebody else crank the engine, or try to crank the engine and see if I have power. But because I don't have anybody here, I've got to get creative. So the way that I'm going to do this is using this wire probe and a long jumper wire, and then I can use my test light and hold my test light up here so that when I get in the car and I press the start button, I can see if it's lit up from the driver's seat. great news because it means that I don't have to worry about there being any other issues like push button or any of the other electronics or control modules. It's just a simple starter. I've got power to it. I've got a signal that's lighting up my test light when I push the button. So yeah, at the end of the day, no matter how many control modules you have on these cars, when you strip it all the way, underneath it all, it's all just basics, right? You've got to start with the basics. No matter what make or model it is, no matter how complex it is electronically, you still have an ignition switch, you have a battery, you have a starter, you have an alternator, you've got wires and connectors. I mean, it's all the same stuff. So once you know the basics, it's just a matter of taking it step by step and figuring it out, starting from the simple and getting into the more complex as you go. So now that we have that figured out, I gotta get at the starter. Now, unfortunately, that means the intake manifold has to come off. The good news is it looks way harder than it actually is. It's really just a bunch of 11mm bolts, disconnecting a whole bunch of wires, and the whole thing will come out of there and we'll be able to see that starter and gain access to it really easily. So I need new gloves and then I'm gonna dig in. There's a ton of stuff I'm gonna remove to make my life easier. My throttle body, the charge boot, I'm gonna take off the engine cover and this insulator. It's all just gonna make everything a whole lot easier to get at. Also, you don't necessarily have to, but I find it easier to remove the two braces. It's 3 bolts, really easy to remove. Might as well, it makes your life easier. Now, when you're removing your intake pipe, you're gonna wanna be very careful because it's plastic and it's brittle, and with all of the heat cycles of the engine over time, they tend to be pretty brittle. So you wanna be real careful removing that. You've got a connector, a bolt, and a hose clamp, and then that will come off. And then we've got 4 10mm bolts that hold the throttle body to the intake manifold. The connection for the throttle body is on the underside, easier to get at once you have it loose. And then we can disconnect some of these other peripheries and just get it all out of the way to make the job a little bit easier. There we go. This cover comes off just with a screwdriver. Disconnect anything that's connected to the intake manifold, as well as all of these wires that are connected to the control module. That's going to allow all of these wires to kind of move out of the way so we can get the intake manifold out of there. Then there's just a series of 11mm bolts and nuts that hold the intake manifold on. We'll remove all of those bolts and nuts, and then the manifold will just come right out of there. Very last one is the tricky one. It's back here and just a little bit difficult to get at. Okay. All right, all of the nuts and bolts are removed. The last thing is to disconnect this line that is running through the intake manifold. All right. I've got the line disconnected from the other side. It's just 2 little push tabs that will release it. And then I've got all of my bolts loose, all of my lines, my electrical connectors are disconnected, everything is out of the way. And now, we just wrestle it out of there. Now, this line that goes through the manifold, I'm not going to be able to feed it through that hole. It's not large enough. I could disconnect it from the other side, but I don't actually need to take this intake manifold all the way off, so I'm just going to set it to the side. And like that. Now, we can actually get at our starter. Now it's pretty straightforward. We've got a nut that holds the battery cables to the starter, and then I've got one inverted Torx bolt going this way, and one inverted Torx bolt going that way through the transmission. And the starter is free. So one quick tip is that both of the bolts are inverted Torx. So like that, right? Now they are E12s, but because of the location of them, they're a little bit difficult to get at with a socket. So you can use just a ratcheting 10 millimeter. That will fit right on there and make it a whole lot easier for you to gain access to both of those bolts and get the leverage that you need to get them broken loose. The one on the back side is incredibly long, so when it seems like it's taking forever to come out, it's not that you're doing anything wrong, it's just a really, really long bolt. So, bolts are out, and now our starter can come out, and there you go, one bad starter. So now we're gonna go ahead and get the new one in, and it's pretty much the same as removal was. No real tips or tricks to it. One thing that you do want to do is replace the bolts because they are aluminum, and BMW recommends that any of their aluminum bolts be replaced anytime that they are used. And because of how much work goes into getting at this thing, I'd recommend putting in a high quality starter. You don't want to use the cheapest one available because it's probably cheap for a reason, and you don't want to have to do this job again anytime soon. I've got close to 100,000 miles on this car, and this is my first time doing the starter. That's about right. I don't want to have to do it until it's at 200,000 miles at least. The other thing that's just kind of good practice is that we go ahead and replace the seals on the throttle body as well as the seals on the intake manifold, just to be on the safe side, and then everything should go back together pretty painlessly, and drive this thing out of here pretty soon. That's pretty much it. Everything else is going back together the same way it came apart. No real tips or tricks for that. All right, moment of truth. I've got all the bare minimums reconnected and trim pieces still off because I figure I might as well test it and make sure we're good to go before I put the finishing touches on. So I'm gonna reconnect the battery and all right, here goes nothing. Yes! Woo! All right, BMW is fixed. Hope you enjoyed this video and learned a thing or two, or at least were mildly entertained. Make sure you hit like, hit subscribe, and leave comments below. Let me know what other types of videos you'd like to see. And until then, be safe out there, be good to one another. We'll see you next time.